What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode, Conspiracy or Just a Coincidence. I am Jack Allen. So today this is the first time I've done this, is when I had a new person I had on the show. I loved listening to him so much. We're doing it again twice in a week. So that is definitely a record. Phil, thank you for joining us again, dude. And how are you doing today, buddy?
Happy to be here, Jack. I am doing well and getting ready to be done with this work week.
Not you and me both, dude. Dude, I always say this, but like in the summer, it's like work's almost easier because I just roll out of bed, put on I can wear like whatever I want to work. I wear, shorts, boom, I'm good. But now I gotta what's the weather? All right, I gotta put on pants. All right, I gotta put on a jacket. It just makes it that much more difficult. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep, I know what you mean.
It's challenging at times. But today, Phil and I, we're going to talk about the mob. I guess it's more like Phil's going to be talking about the mob. Yes, Chris, Phil is back. Thanks for coming in, Chris. And John from We've Read, he might be joining us later. But everybody loves the mob. So it's a topic that I think regular people, they might have like a different idea. I'd be interested to hear what Phil's idea is. But my thinking is the mob was allowed to spread and grow and make all this money because it was just it was like the hit arm of the CIA and the United States government. I mean, for 40 years or whatever, J. Edgar Hoover said there is no organized crime in America when they knew there was organized crime. So what's your take, Phil? What is your take on the mob? You think positively, negatively? What's your gut reaction?
A little bit of both. I mean, my first exposure was the fictional version, which was The Godfather. And because it used to be on, I mean, now it's on TV a lot too. But when I was a kid, I remember it being on pretty frequently and my parents explaining it to me. And but then it was like Goodfellas. And Goodfellas was like another one where it was just like boom. And, I got started. Every now and then you'd hear it on the news. There'd be something about a mob hit or a mob arrest. And then I started, seeing it more in the newspapers, and I was just kind of like, it interested me. Like I'd seen the occasional gangster movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because there's some horrible mob movies out there too. But you got to think in terms of the mafia, you have really your Godfather people, you have your Goodfellas people, and you have your Sopranos.
That is true, dude. You're right. It's like I would agree with that. It is. Yeah.
All come full circle. All have great books written about them in terms of the making of and whatnot. The mob couldn't exist without a wink and a nod from the government.
I like that.
In some form, whether it be the municipal government. I mean, you look at Tammany Hall in New York. You went from the evolution of the five gangs. The 5 Points gangs, which were mostly, they were semi-organized, but they weren't Italian at most part.
That's the movie with Leo and
Gangs of New York. It was
okay.
A guy named Herbert Asbury had written a book about 1927. But that was the Plug Uglies, the Know Nothings, the Dead Rabbits. There was groups like that, and the Bowery Boys.
Names, dude.
Oh my God, yeah, and. It kind of evolved from there. And then you had the beginnings of the Black Hand, which was, originally kind of known for being extortionists. And, they'd send a letter with a black hand to shop owners, basically threatening consequences, possibly dire consequences if you didn't pay.
Okay.
Or if you went to law enforcement. They, in Godfather 2, they highlight that with the character that a young Vito Corleone, De Niro kills, Don Fanucci, who's Black Hand. And it went from there to you had the Black Hand boss, then you kind of had what they called the Mustache Pete's, the old school Sicilians, and you had.
What time frame is Black Hand? So I'm trying to
early 20s,
early
really
20s.
Before Prohibition really started the beginnings of the organization of the crime.
So it's not the mob yet. It's not like the mafia that we know it yet.
Yeah, not really. No.
Okay.
I think it's a little. I mean, the mafia, there are stirrings. There is what they called the Honored Society, which was, it just was almost kind of loose confederation to a degree. It wasn't as established, and by the time you get through the 20s, it's kind of like you have a bloodletting to a degree, but that's throughout the decade because you have the wars for control of the liquor trade. I mean, prohibition's what, 1920 to 1933. And between New York, Chicago, I mean, Chicago was a bullet festival, and Capone emerges on top. But really, in the end, it was like hollow victory because he only gets to be on top for a certain amount of time, and then he's shipped off to jail. And
Good point.
Yeah, you had the Castellammarese War, which was a war between two rival bosses, Joe Masseria and a guy named Salvatore Maranzano.
They're in Boardwalk Empire.
Yeah, they're the ones who kind of were the older figures, while you had people like Luciano and Costello and, Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who were looked down on by not Luciano and Costello, but Maranzano and Masseria because they were Jewish.
Right.
You had, your Irish guys going around like Mad Dog Cole and Oni Madden, I think might have been an Englishman, but you had them, Dutch Schultz. But after you have all this bloodletting, including the Castellammarese War, which was a territorial thing where you were from in Italy. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Luciano, 1931 is a pivotal year in there. So there's already been a lot of killing, a lot of law enforcement focus because there's like, how much longer can this go on? And Luciano sets up Joe the Boss Masseria. And Masseria, I think, had survived already about a dozen attempts on his life. And Luciano takes him to a place in Coney Island, has a big lunch because Masseria was a glutton, big guy. Okay. Not the first or the last of the fat bosses, but a big guy. And he goes, Luciano, after they're playing cards, they've been at this lunch for maybe like 3 or 4 hours. Luciano excuses himself, washes his hands, and while he's washing his hands, a group of guys come in. I believe it might have been, I think Bugsy Siegel was there, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, I think Albert Anastasia was there, like a collection of gunmen wipe out Joe the Boss.
Damn.
And because they want to say at this point, no more boss of bosses, no more of this like top boss. And Salvatore Maranzano was like, oh, this is great. Now we're going to consolidate. We're going to do the 5 families. Yeah. But I am what they call the capi di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. So Maranzano didn't learn a thing. And Maranzano plots Luciano's murder and a few others. And one of the people who hears about it, I believe, was Joe Bonanno, who was one of the earliest bosses. And Luciano finds out. They send a crew. This is like only about 5 months after Masseria's murder. And they go, it winds up being like 4 or 5 guys. I think it was mostly like guys who'd eventually be like Murder Incorporated guys. Go to Maranzano's office, because Maranzano was a well-to-do guy, posing as Internal Revenue agents, and proceed to stab him, shoot him, and then I think they may have thrown him out of his office, like out of the office window.
Damn, dude.
While they passed Mad Dog Cole, the Irishman, who was going to be used to take out these guys.
Like Mazzarano called the Irish guy to take out the guys that were running the hit on him.
Yeah, Maranzano was going to use Cole against Luciano and those guys. The guys saw Cole and were like, go. Yeah. They kind of let him go, but he'd be taken out a few years later because his moniker Mad Dog was he killed a baby.
Oh my God.
During a shootout.
Okay.
He went to war with, I think it was Dutch Schultz. And Dutch Schultz would have his own end a few years after that. But during a shooting, a crossfire, a baby, I believe in a stroller, was killed.
Oh, my God.
And then that kind of cemented his Mad Dog legacy. And then afterwards, they set him up to be hit because clearly a loose cannon you can't have around.
Right.
And, of course, later on, Dutch Schultz would want Thomas Dewey hit, the prosecutor.
Right.
And the mob stepped in and was like, yeah, that's not going to happen.
Well,
they took
Dewey... He tried to run for president, right? But before
Twice.
He was governor of New York, right? Am I wrong?
Okay. Governor of New York. Before then, he was if he wasn't DA, he was U.S. attorney. I mean, he was kind of like a Giuliani back in the day.
Right, exactly. And so because have you ever read Operation Gladio by Paul Williams?
I have. I like that. That was a good book.
Amazing book. But they bring up there how he he caught Luciano with hundreds of prostitutes that he has them all hooked on heroin. He arrests him. He's so happy. And then I think it was the OSS at that time. Might have been Wild Bill Donovan. Somebody visits Luciano in prison. They say, we're going to send you to Italy. You can't come back, but we need you to organize there. And he gets out of this like insane, like a 500-year sentence or whatever.
He was, he had actually he was all the way, I think, in Dannemora, which he saw as like Siberia. And eventually when I guess they appealed to his patriotism, if you will.
Yes.
And I think they reached out I think Lansky might have made the approach to Luciano. Okay. And he was like, well, first thing, get me out of here. So they moved him to a prison closer to the city. They promised to help shore up the safety of the waterfront, which they owned. Yes. I mean, they were the waterfront. Right. Like they had guys on the waterfront. So it was almost kind of like, we were already doing that anyway. And then I think Luciano was involved with this too, when the Americans landed in Sicily to give the go-ahead for if you want to call it the Sicilian cousins, to make it easier for them, because Mussolini, you could almost say to a degree, to his credit, but not what he did to him, went after the mafia.
Yes.
There. But he also, used a guy who was a torturer too. I think the guy's name was Mori, Cesare Mori.
See, I struggle with that. Because Mussolini and Hitler both kicked out Freemasonry, and Mussolini obviously went after the mob. Why? History tells us Mussolini was this horrendous. Why is he threatened by the mob? Do you think? That's
the only reason I could think of, truth be told. But I'll give you another crazy. So while all this is going on, you get someone like the eventual boss of his own family, Vito Genovese, who leaves New York, fleeing at least one or two murder raps.
Yes. Yeah.
Winds up in Italy, winds up working for the black shirts, working for like Mussolini's side.
Way.
Yeah. Then when the war ends, like he had a journalist who was a socialist, Carlo Tresca, murdered. I think it was 1943. And I think he used a guy who would eventually be acting boss of the Bananos, Carmine Galante, for that hit.
Damn.
And Genovese was like big into the black market. After the war, and eventually they kicked him out, and he was back here again. And at which point the murder charge had kind of disappeared.
Right. Well, didn't the CIA use Genovese especially, and they had him open up pizza shops, right? And that was one of the. I remember reading something. It might have not been I'm pretty sure it was, but in Gladio they talked about how he opened up all these pizza shops, Philly to Jersey, New York City, and they were all money laundering fronts.
It wouldn't surprise me, considering that later on in the 80s there's the Pizza Connection case that gets broken up, that started by one of the Sicilian bosses with the cooperation of our guys here. I wouldn't be surprised if it went back decades. So I'm kind of in agreement with you on that.
I'm pretty sure I remember reading that in and then I made because I told my everyone loves the mob, and I told we always make the joke, because even where I live there's like 12 pizza shops in a 2-mile radius, and not anymore. I think a lot of actually Mexican people own the pizza shops around here, but there's no way that these are all profitable. I mean, I don't think the mob's strong anymore, but there's got to be some money like there's no way. There's just no way.
Yeah. There's always going to be. I think there's always going to be a way for them to exist, because there's always going to be something that's not going to be regulated. Or even if let's say even if they make gambling legal in every aspect, well, places like your Harrah's, your organized places, your corporations, they're not going to extend credit to certain of these people, the gamblers. So at that point, you're going to go over to maybe your local bookie who's still making some money here and there. And, who's to say that guy's an independent? Almost all those guys are connected.
Yeah.
And, if there's a vice, if there's a way to get something that you can't get from someone else, I think there'll always be organized crime. Because how many times can I keep having these busts where they say it's the death knell of organized crime? They do this all the time.
Yeah.
I said, the New York mob benefited when the FBI switched to terrorism, like post 9/11 and everything like that. And they're still making busts being like, this is the death of the mob. This is the death of the mob. I said, some of these guys are smart. They're not idiots. You get a guy like Sonny Franzese, who lived to over 100 years old as a top mobster in the Colombo family. And he's the one who had his two sons who kind of turned against him in the life of the mob. Mikey Franzese, who has written a couple books and has been on TV. He succeeded. He was involved with the record industry, because that was notoriously dirty with the payola and everything like that. And all you just needed was at least street smarts. If you didn't have brain, like actual like book smarts, street smarts, a way to survive. And because a lot of these guys never even graduated like grade school, if not high school. Mm-hmm. You didn't have your college graduates, your things like that. And that's not to, trust it. How good are some of us with college degrees at this point? It's kind of like, but yeah, these guys survived, and they, when you find a way to exploit, whether it be human weakness, so gambling, prostitution, drugs, I said, you're in. Yeah. Like at that point, you have someone hooked. Look at something like that scene in Goodfellas where the guy Sonny, the one whose place eventually gets burned down, but the guy who's asking for help with Joe Pesci. And then Paulie's like, when he says, maybe think about taking a piece of the joint, figuring by getting a partner, he could have Joe Pesci pay his debts and not smack him around and treat him like, I'm not going to finish the rest of the word, but, and then he does it. But then at the same time, now you got someone who's going to demand to be paid no matter what happens. Mm-hmm. And now you've got a partner who maybe you shouldn't have. Like it gets you influence, but now it also gets you handcuffed. A guy like Paulie.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, continue.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say about, just to bring it to like the pre or post, I guess post World War II. That was how heroin and these drugs became so popular, was because the CIA needed some organization to disperse this. And Lucky Luciano was the perfect guy, and all these other guys. And it's just hilarious, though, that they like Giuliani in the 90s or whatever does this that builds him up, that RICO charge. And they made him a hero, when really the past 50 years, the U.S. government's working directly hand in hand with the mob. But no one thinks about that.
Well, have you heard how Giuliani came to charge to go after the commission?
No, please tell me.
He was watching Joe Bonanno, who was retired, quote unquote retired. Mm-hmm. He was kind of put out to pasture after trying to mastermind a hit on other bosses. Was living out in Arizona, and he's interviewed for 60 minutes. And he has a book called The Man of Honor, like an autobiography about his life in the mob. And he mentions the commission. And Giuliani, based off that, or so the story goes, decides to look into it and eventually go after the reigning bosses of, New York on the commission. Because meanwhile, the commission really can be national. At one point there was 25, 26 mafia families.
I didn't know
and it is insane. And the only pictures that the government truly got, or at least, as got put in the media, was when Joe Valachi, turned, violated omerta and testified in front of the McClellan Committee. I think it was around this time, 1963, about a couple months before JFK got killed. And that was huge. But then you find out that maybe it wasn't all from Valachi, and the FBI had an informant before then named Greg Scarpa. And Greg Scarpa, a.k.a. the Grim Reaper, was kind of like the FBI's dirty secret. Because
why is that?
He was a hitman for the Colombos. I think he went all the way up to captain. And at one point, the FBI got rid of him as an informant because they knew he was still. They say you're not supposed to murder or do stuff like this.
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
Well, they're going to commit crimes, because how are they supposed to stay functioning?
Right.
How are they supposed to be a viable member of their crew or as a leader if all of a sudden they're like, we're doing it the straight way from now on? So
absolutely.
He's actually utilized, number one, to provide the information they use to kind of back up Valachi's story, or help propel Valachi a little bit further, because they said Valachi didn't even know certain states of the Union, and I only found this out when I was reading the author Peter Lance, who's written a set of great books, and one was Deal with the Devil about the FBI and Greg Scarpa. But he also wrote a few 9/11 related books as well. And with Scarpa, at one point they deactivate him, whatever you want to call it, as an informant.
Okay.
He's reactivated by a guy named Linley Del Vecchio. And I think DeVecchio was dirty. He did get charged because he's the guy who at one point during the Colombo War in the 90s said, we're going to win this thing. And people are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
What do you mean we're going to win this thing? People are dead. A couple innocent people got killed. And we're going to win this thing. But going back to Scarpa, at one point, he is utilized and sent down south to help get the confession of a local cracker in Mississippi who would, and I use that term because that's what the guy was, who had information about 3 civil rights workers who went missing.
No way.
Yeah, that they'd use in the movie Mississippi Burning, but to keep their version out of it, it was a black man in the movie.
Hilarious, dude.
Yes.
Of course.
But Scarpa did exactly what the guy does, basically threatened to, I think, castrate the guy unless they gave him the names. And, and Hoover knew. I mean, Hoover. So Hoover is essential to understanding how the mob, besides so many of the other relationships with, governors and mayors and cops and all these things, Hoover's blind eye to the mob, whether it be because he was compromised, because they had blackmail on him, which has been hinted at in a lot of ways, because the rumored relationship with Clyde Tulson is number 2, and the possible cross-dressing. But I don't know. Like the cross-dressing, I think is kind of, could be urban legend, but
yeah,
he was involved with Tulson. There was definitely something there. Well, and some said that the mob had compromising photos on him.
Interesting.
Others have said Jim Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence, who had his own mob connections, might have been the one to have it and use that. But Hoover also used to go to the racetracks out in California, and he'd be hobnobbing with some of these guys. He knew Frank Costello. I believe he knew Johnny Roselli. If it wasn't direct, it was like friends of friends.
Yeah.
It wasn't something he could deny. But then 1957 is a pivotal year to a lot of this. First, you have the daylight execution of Albert Anastasia in New York. And he's the boss who, after he's murdered, Carlo Gambino takes over. And so after that, not even 2-3 weeks later, there's a meeting of the commission in a town called Appalachian in upstate New York.
Okay.
And it gets raided by a guy whose name happened to be Edgar. Edgar Crosswell was the name of the cop who saw a local guy named Joe Barbara, who was an alleged, I think they said he owned like a Canada Dry bottling plant or something, but a very well-to-do guy. And Crosswell's like, there's a lot of people up here with out-of-state plates, like a cop who was looking for, like, had a good eye and called it in. And next thing you know, there's a raid. I mean, they show it in the movie Analyze This, like all these bosses trying to run through. And that happened. I mean, and they were, because Vito Genovese was the one who put it together. And there was the rumor that he was going to try to say he was the new boss of bosses.
Okay.
And, there's been stories going around that Gambino and a couple other guys used the meeting as a trap to screw Genovese, because afterwards Genovese was never as powerful, and within a few years he was in jail and would die in jail. Along with he actually went to jail with Vincent the Chin Gigante, the one who used to mumble, walk through Greenwich Village in his bathrobe, pulling a crazy act.
When he's trying to act crazy. Yeah.
Well, he had been used earlier that year. He's the one who tried to kill Frank Costello, and he said, "This is for you, Frank." Frank turns his head, the bullet grazes his scalp, and he lives.
Jeez.
Because Gigante calls out, like kind of gave himself up. I mean, Gigante might not have been, at least at the time, that smart. He was he was a good boxer, but he was kind of like, I think some thought he was punchy, at that point. Might have had a little bit of the damage. And, but eventually, Costello stuck with Omerta, didn't identify Gigante, as his shooter. But couldn't say he wasn't pissed.
Right.
You know?
Well, obviously, I'd be a little upset too.
Appalachian, they said there might have been 100 people up there.
So that's fat. I didn't. It's so because I know the exact. And for anybody that hasn't seen Analyze That, so they're at like this farmhouse, right? It's like in the middle of nowhere, and all these like Rolls Royces pull up. Right, right, fella. It's something like that. And then
they were grilling steaks, all this food. They had ordered all this stuff. A bunch of them were staying in a local motel, which was that was one of the first signs to Crosswell. He's like, who are these guys? Oh, Joe Barber, he's sick. He's not feeling too good. A bunch of his friends are coming to visit him from Chicago, from LA. I think Giancana was there from Chicago. I mean, guys from out in LA. Paul Castellano was there. Like, you had all these guys. They wrangled, I think, a few dozen. They couldn't really hold them, though, because for the most part, it was like, unless maybe they were violating their parole, it was kind of dicey on what they could actually, it was consorting,
Right.
They didn't, the story goes, they didn't even get to do the meeting, why they were there for, which was supposed to be about drugs, what they were going to do about that.
Yeah.
And there was also the fact that memberships, which is supposed to be a sacred thing, were being sold.
Damn.
Yeah. The underboss for Anastasia, a guy named Frank Scalise, who would be murdered in, I think, 57 as well, was alleged to have been selling mafia memberships for like thousands of dollars. They're like, why would we, that kind of like that scene when, once again, in Goodfellas, when Joe Pesci's yelling at Frank Vincent saying he bought his fucking button, and he's like, some guys were known, like, they were accused of that. It's like, did you actually do a piece of work? Did you earn your way there? Or did you just, throw some money here? And, it's a possibility.
Yeah.
And
because we were talking, just to go back to Luciano, because I just found my notes. So it was Dulles and James Forrestal were the guys putting the pressure on Dewey to commute Luciano's sentence. And so, when I remember when I read that, I was like, is another weird thing in Forrestal's background that, that he jumps out of, he ends up in the psych at Bethesda, jumps out of the 16th floor window. Everyone loves jumping out of windows when they're involved with these intelligence organizations. But
let me give you a little parallel with Forrestal.
Yes,
so one of the more infamous mob deaths is a guy named Abe Relis. Abe Relis was a hitman and a pretty prolific one, for Murder Incorporated. The guys
Can you just say what Murder I've seen? What is Murder Inc. again?
Murder Inc. was kind of like now mostly Jewish gunmen. There were some Italians in there as well, but guys like what were the names? So Abe Relis, there was a guy Charlie Workman, whose nickname was the Bug. Phil Strauss, Happy My Own, Frank Abendondo. I mean, there was like so many different names in these groups. Mendy Weiss. They used to congregate in like a candy shop. I think it was called like something Roses. It was like just crazy. They were like Brownsville area of Brooklyn, like a very certain area. But these guys were alleged to have done as many as 1,000 hits over time.
Wow.
Different families. A lot of times it really revolved around the garment center type, trade. The guy who was seen as like the head, you had Albert Anastasia, who was like up there, but also a guy named Lepke Buchalter, who was big into the rackets. I think he might have also been involved in the drug racket. And Murder Inc. would be their enforcement arm. So Abe Relis gets busted at one point, and for murder, because at one point the murders just started stacking on top of each other. And he decides he's going to talk. And so immediately people were like concerned. I think Anastasia fled. Buchalter flees, but then through kind of a conspiracy between Hoover and I think Walter Winchell, the news guy, and local authorities in New York, they get Lepke to surrender for one charge, not realizing he's doomed and he's going to die in the electric chair for the Murder Inc. charges. And Abe Relis at one point is under guard at a place called the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. The cops are watching him. November 41, this is. They find him dead at the bottom. Like, he was on the 6th floor. He's dead on like the bottom floor. And someone sees him from like an adjacent building or something towards that effect. And they're like, oh, there's bed sheets. Well, there were cops outside the door.
Yeah.
Well, they're like, maybe he was climbing, but there were certain things that didn't make sense to anything. They're like, oh, he might have been trying to screw around, climb down, and then he was going to surprise us.
Yeah, that's what everyone does when they're under, lock and key.
He was a prankster,
Yeah.
And then, but so with his death, despite the fact he did a lot of damage, Buchalter, about, I want to say half dozen to like 8 or 9 other guys went to the electric chair in New York for the murder. So like he had an impact. It made careers, even though the cops had egg on their face because, a witness dies under your care.
Right.
Anastasia avoided, death for at least another 15, 16 years and would wind up being a boss and a nut job at that. I mean, his nickname was the Mad Hatter. I mean, he used to, he ordered a guy killed who went on TV after fingering the bank robber, Willie Sutton. And, the guy who supposedly said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. And the guy, this citizen, sees Sutton, calls the cops, and then is bragging about it on TV. And Albert Anastasia's like, I don't like rats. Hit that guy. And then
ruthless.
They killed him. And then the guy who killed him, they killed. So it was, the loyalty level's not there. And I think like so many of these things, like with the mafia, you have to reach a point where it shocks the public conscience before something's ever done. In a lot of these cases, like where's the line? Yeah. Well, sometimes it's got to be that shocking act that finally gets people to move, or just be John Gotti, where you're just, thumbing your nose at, law enforcement. And who's to say? I think John Gotti, I mean, I've read enough stuff. I think he might have been involved with the CIA in certain aspects.
I wouldn't be surprised. Like all these guys, they're so close. I mean, you can't, even back then when I always make this like joke, like crime must have been so easy to get away with in the 1920s or 30s. I mean, I forget when they finally said it was before that, the whole state line thing. So you could rob a bank. And if you got across the state line, you were good. I mean, dude, that's like, I would rob banks then too. I just got to make it 100 feet or, 1,000 yards, please. I'll start doing it,
or just pay off someone who's not making that much in their job and it's not worth it. Like again, exploiting a weakness. And, you just look at how long, some of these families had strangleholds. I mean, the Chicago outfit, I think they said up until the 70s, there'd never been, I think most gangland killings, like 99%, went unsolved because there was never witnesses or never willing witnesses.
Right.
And
isn't that crazy, man? Think people were so in the neighborhood or whatever, they knew, I mean, that's power, dude. People are I mean, today, the cartel probably has that power, but
oh God, yeah.
But in America, beyond them, no, there's these street gangs like the Bloods and the Crips and things the media hypes them up, but I lived in that world for 10 years and there was it's nothing like that kind of power where people are afraid if they see something that they wouldn't say, even if to save their own butt, they wouldn't talk, what I mean? But today people in their own gang rat out just as quick.
Oh God. Yeah. Especially if there's something, you can save your neck. And then, hey, maybe like Sammy the Bull at one point, get your own book. You want to keeping most of your money. Like there was so many dirty things to that deal he got. We'll never even know. Yeah. And look now what happened with him at one point when there was allegations that he might not have been completely truthful in his testimony. You had the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski.
Right. I've
making an allegation that Gravano was in on a hit of a cop. And Gravano confessed to 19 murders. He got 5 years for 19 murders because of the testimony against Gotti.
God.
Yeah, it was, insane. Gotti got convicted, April 92. And don't get me wrong, a lot of it is Gotti screwed Gravano. Like you hear those tapes, he's indicating Gravano in multiple murders. Not even saying is really his own guilt. I said I always felt bad for the one guy, Frank Locascio, who was I think he was the consigliere of the family, who's talking with Gotti, but not confessing to anything. But he gets indicted for it. You know, he gets brought in on those charges, and allegedly LoCascio and Gravano plotted to kill Gotti because it was Gotti's big mouth.
Right.
You know,
right.
Got him into it. So when Gravano is telling the feds he's willing to talk, that's the golden goose right there. And, you know, even though he confesses to something as horrible as killing his own brother-in-law, you know, all these other things, like, I mean, and, you know, and most of it was money. I mean, there was ones Gotti told him to do and whatnot, but you just see how quick these guys turn on each other.
Right.
And, you know, this family was, you know, dysfunctional to say the least. I mean, Gotti ran the family actively for 5 years, not even.
Yeah.
You know, he was in jail, and most of the time he was on trial. I mean, they brought him to trial 4 times. If you include the traffic fight he got in with the one guy, you know, 4 times. And, you know, it's insane.
What do you think? So I was like shocked when I don't know why, because if you don't research the mob. So I remember when I first found out that like Rothstein, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy, they were Jewish. What do you think the connection is? Because you don't see any Jewish gangster. I mean, not in the sense that you did with these guys. Yeah. Like what spurred that? Why were they? Because they were also outcasts in New York, or they had these large communities in same area, maybe persecution.
Outcasts, poor in a lot of cases, looking to make a buck. I mean, Meyer Lansky, you know, they tell the story when he was a kid, seeing like, I think a game of chance, and he was supposed to get something at the store for his mom, like food or something, and he uses it and loses the money. Now it's the pride of losing the money, and having to explain to his mom what he did with the money, and not having the food that he was supposed to get. Siegel might have just been as batshit as his nickname. I mean,
really,
Benjamin Siegel. You know, you see the pictures. Nice, good-looking, like handsome guy. Bat crap crazy in a lot of ways, and hair trigger temper. You know, to do things. Insanely jealous, like when he's with Virginia Hill, who was kind of like a mob lady in every possible way, and passed around like, you know,
a homie hopper.
Yeah, pretty much. She was an interesting one. But yeah, and Siegel's death could have been, they always say it has to do with the flamingo and everything, but I've heard there was possibility he was involved in the drug trade in Mexico.
And what year do you think that was?
It was in the 40s. Doug Valentine, who wrote the Phoenix Program book, he did Strength of the Wolf and Strength of the Pack.
You read that book?
Yeah, I love all those books.
Dude,
Doug Valentine's a good guy.
I read that. I stopped it at like 70% because it's a great book. And we're talking Phoenix Project for anyone that doesn't, and that's why I did a few shows on it, but it felt like his book was more like how would I run a guerrilla warfare campaign if I want to do in America, as opposed to like some conspiracy books. They're very like, and this person's connected, you know, they're like very fantastical. Yeah. And so by the end, I was like, I feel like I'm just learning like insurgency strategies from Doug. I
think he did interview some guys who survived, like who were involved with it. I know that.
Yeah.
But yeah, he did within a couple of years back in the mid 2000s. He had done The Strength of the Wolf, which was about the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and then The Strength of the Pack, which was when Federal Bureau of Narcotics became Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and then the DEA. And there's a constant intersection between, obviously, the drug war, these agents, and organized crime. And, you know, he gets into it. I mean, I think the first time I found the book was because I was looking something up on Amazon about the French Connection case.
Yes.
And it popped up.
Right.
You know, that book popped up. And I was like, okay, now I got to get the book. Right. And, you know, I said, Doug Valentine's very, very good guy. I read a few of his books.
Well, I made this joke every time I talked about my Phoenix Program episodes, but so if anybody hasn't seen the French Connection, maybe you haven't seen my joke. It was the largest drug bust in the history of the United States at the time. And I was like, and I remember watching the movie, and like I said, I was addicted to drugs. So I loved anything about drugs. And I was like, France, why the hell? Why are they getting heroin from France? Like, what? And then after reading Doug's book, I realized that the French were in Vietnam for hundreds of years. The Korean mafia, knew how to manufacture it. And that's why these Korean mafias was so powerful, because they had the supply, they had all these labs. And that was, but when I saw that movie, I was, because, I'm thinking Mexico, mob, the French, what the hell the French got all this heroin for?
And then the best part with the French Connection is that about 80% of it disappeared out of police storage. Someone substituted it. Swear to God. I read about it in the 90s. It was actually a guy who would become a witness, and then eventually they disowned him. Gas Pipe Casso, Anthony Casso, who was the underboss of the Lucchese family. And him and his cohort, Vic Amuso, who were running the Lucchese's, were basically murdering anybody they suspected of being a rat or disloyal in any way.
Okay.
And I think they killed about, in the late 80s, early 90s, about a few dozen. And eventually Casso utilized two cops, Lou Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, as hitters, because those guys would be busted about a handful of years ago and would wind up going to jail for murder. Casso alleged a couple things, one of which was Sammy Gravano was involved in drug dealing. And Sammy Gravano never copped to that. And, the FBI doesn't want to hear that. And just like Kuklinski's allegation, can't have that. Cannot, because that could ruin every case Gravano ever testified in.
Right, because how can you trust this guy? You're a good attorney. You'll get out of that with that kind of,
So Casso also mentioned, though, that he knew someone who was involved in the French Connection heroin theft. And then later, it became, right as they disavowed him, well, he's probably lying. The French Connection heroin, there was a great movie many years ago, Prince of the City, with Treat Williams. It was really good. Treat Williams, Jerry Orbach. It was the NYPD's SIU, Special Investigative Unit. And they were called Princes of the City, because they were plainclothes detectives, but dressed to the nines, always making these high profile busts.
Okay.
And at one point, the guy's real name was Bob Lucci. And Lucci decides to clear his conscience, and he was just sick of seeing things like strung out sick junkies and stuff, having to supply them, rob someone else to do that.
Yeah. And
he confesses right when there's about to be these next set of hearings. You had the Knapp Commission, which was in and around Serpico, the whole Serpico thing. They were set to have more hearings, and Lucci confesses to this guy, Nick Scoppetta, who eventually would go up in hierarchy of the NYPD and FDNY. And he wears a wire on certain people, but he's like, I'm never giving up my partners. And at a point, that's not going to hold anymore.
Right.
And he also says, I did 3 illegal acts during my time as an SIU cop. 3. And then they find out that's not completely true, because again, those would have involved the people he doesn't want to testify against. Meanwhile, Lucci's cousin is a gangster. He's friends with gangsters. He was involved. And at one point, though, they ask him, does he know who stole the French Connection heroin?
Okay.
Because it was going to ruin the case. I mean, they found out most of it, I think, had been replaced with flour.
Nice. Solid.
Yeah, so I don't think they ever found out who did it, but it became a thorn in the side of the NYPD, because it tells you right then and there who had access, who could run off with what at the time was the bust of the century. It's huge,
the largest amount.
Yeah, and you just look at even the guys who were involved that they did the French Connection movie about, Eddie Egan, Popeye Doyle. He almost got bounced out of the NYPD, not for being crooked, but because he had been involved with movies and stuff. Okay. And his partner, Sonny Grosso, became Hollywood, did some of those cop shows. There was Cops, but there was Top Cops, which is another real life story of cops. It went sideways fast. But Casso's allegations, they just kind of threw him out, because at that point, when you're going to, again, kill the golden goose, They're not going to have that. And especially since Gravano got it.
Right.
You know? And informants, the relationship between the FBI and informants, I mean, 2 words, Whitey Bulger.
Yeah, someone in the chat brought it up when we started, and I was like, oh, we'll have to bring up Whitey.
Oh, God, yeah. Have to.
Yeah.
Well, it's up to you. You tell me where you want to go.
Well, actually, let's go, because you brought up the Mexican, like a connection with Mexico before. So could you, and someone else in the chat brought up something about Mexico and alcohol, but when did Mexico get involved with the drug trade? Do you know?
I want to say it might have been the 30s or the 40s. They in Doug Valentine's book, he mentions a guy named Happy Meltzer, who was a gangster who was involved down there. And that one of the reasons for Siegel's hit, he also said Rothstein's murder wasn't a gambling thing, was related to drugs. But
interesting.
He definitely says Siegel, it had to do with the route that Siegel was undertaking through Mexico to bring back drugs into the States. And now, again, Mexico, a country that we've been involved with in one way or another in overthrowing governments and everything like that for so long, who's to say? You know, like I couldn't really pinpoint it. But reading,
so there is a long history here.
Oh God, yeah.
I didn't know that.
There's a great book I read that kind of gave a history of it, but it also connects with Kennedy, called Our Man in Mexico.
Okay.
And Jefferson Morley, very, very good author. I referenced some of the stuff with Watergate. He did Scorpion's Dance about Helms and Nixon. But Our Man in Mexico is about a guy named Winston Scott, who was like the chief of station in Mexico when the infamous Oswald picture that wasn't Oswald was taken.
Okay.
The one where they say is Lee Harvey Oswald, and it's a guy who's about 100 pounds heavier.
Okay.
And yeah, so they talk about our influence with the Mexican governments and, you know, calling the shots, and said we still have. I mean, we still are.
Yeah.
You know, none of them are going to buck the system too much, because then they'll be taken out by one of the cartels that we probably are funneling through the next version of Fast and Furious.
Right.
Absolutely,
dude.
I said guns, drugs. It's all
connected.
It's all connected. I still think there's Paul Castellano's hit. When he gets killed in 85, one of the things that helped bring it about started with one of John Gotti's crew. His good friend Angelo Ruggiero. Ruggiero, another guy, big mouth.
Okay.
Angelo was involved with his brother Sal in heroin importing. Sal gets killed in a plane crash on basically trying to import. I think he got killed. I think it was in Georgia. And Angelo, who was Neil Della Croce, who was like the legendary underboss of the Gambinos. Angelo, despite the fact knowing there'd probably be a bug on his phone, uses his daughter's phone to make a lot of drug deals.
Okay.
He gets arrested. John Gotti's brother, Gene, gets arrested, and a bunch of other guys for heroin. And, you know, the mafia's had speaking out of both sides of their mouths about drug dealing.
Right. Yeah.
You know, some would say deal and die was one. You know, if you're dealing, we're going to kill you. But it's more like you get caught, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
Because when they started putting in minimum sentencing, you know, like mandatory sentencing on some of these drug crimes, that was a prime, you know, that's prime, you know, that's prime territory for someone who's looking at 25 to life to be like, you know what, I can tell you some things about my boss.
Absolutely,
you know?
Dude.
And
absolutely.
You saw off the whole thing with Luciano, with the prostitution thing, kind of how you'd eventually get to the RICO stuff, because with Luciano, the testimony was so kind of flimsy about, like, they were like, yeah, we think he took money. They got their star witness's name was Cokie Flo, for God's sake, you know? And that's not to denigrate anybody who's had issues. That's not it.
Right. No.
It was
how
very
reliable
shaky.
is that?
It was very shaky evidence, to say the least. But then these guys worried. Like that line, I'm going to reference Goodfellas again. When Paulie says to Henry, you know, you're not involved in that, are you? He's like, I'm telling you. He's like, I'm not going out like Gribbs. And that was another boss in the Lucchese family. He's like, he got 20 to life for saying hello to someone who's dealing behind his back. That ain't going to happen to me, you know?
Yeah, right.
And that's in a lot of cases. If you took money By the time RICO was designed, I think, in 1970 by Robert Blakey, who was a professor at Notre Dame, and eventually was the head of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who let the CIA lie to him in a lot of ways, even though he's starting to finally realize that. They designed it to connect the lower level to the top level just by chain of, hey, I'm giving you money for my operations. You're taking it. Yeah. We've established a pattern.
Yes.
And criminal organization. Right. And RICO was the death knell for anybody.
It was. Yeah.
I mean, you look at the commission cases, they all got 100 years. I said, the only one one guy who got convicted in that entire case is still alive. Everybody else is dead. Most of them were already on the way out when it happened. But
right. Well, so this brings up my next. So, obviously, the mob, we've already established they work hand in hand with the government in many ways. How about these other gangs? Like I'm thinking of like Hell's Angels, because I think I just saw something in the news that somebody in Florida he's on trial or whatever. And a lot of these, I also would go under the assumption that they're somehow involved because I think of Manson case. Was it Hell's Angels who they were involved with Manson's team, or the one guy was from
Bobby Beausoleil, I think, was their connection. And what was the guy's name? Danny. I remember the one guy's name too.
But he was, because in that book Chaos, they bring up him. Book. Yeah, amazing book. But they bring him up about, I don't know if he was running hits or giving drugs. Was he? I think he was providing the drugs, wasn't he? He was giving drugs to Manson's organization.
Yeah,
pretty.
I think so. Well, there's a lot of people who believe still that the Tate murders were a drug hit. Mm-hmm. That it was a hit. It wasn't. Which, by the way, is the sloppiest hit of all time. I mean, hits don't look like that.
No.
A hit normally is 22, 44, not stabbings and
not painting phrases on the wall. Not a usual sign of a hit. No.
Not sending texts and, Sadie and all them up there. No. But yeah, no, the Hells Angels, it's tough to say because, they kind of, I think, play to their own tune. And I don't know if it was a Hells Angels, but I know it was a motorcycle chapter that had an alliance up in Montreal with Vito Rizzuto and the mob up there.
Interesting.
He did the show Bad Blood was about that. And it was about Vito Rizzuto, who was connected with the Bananos and would go to jail based on the infamous hit of the three mob captains in 81 that they'd show in the movie Donnie Brasco. Rizzuto, who was in the mob with his dad and whatnot, decided to kind of forge an alliance with the various gangs to get everything working. And I think it was the Jamaicans, I think it was the Irish, and it was the bikers. And then Vito goes to jail, and then everything goes sideways. Yeah. And eventually his father's killed, his son's killed. I mean, the war's still going on, I think, up there. I mean, it's insane. But some of these other groups, like you think even back to Prohibition, you had Irish and Italian. If they weren't warring, they were working together. Mm-hmm. You had the Westies, at a Hell's Kitchen, a bunch of Irish guys. Oh, you've never heard of the Westies?
No.
Oh my God. So the Westies, now talk about a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
So they were out of Hell's Kitchen in New York City, and they at first were doing kidnappings. They would occasionally kidnap mobsters and extort for ransom.
That's hilarious, dude. What an idea.
Yeah, they were.
That is brilliant, dude. That's brilliant.
They were definitely crazy. So at one point in the 70s, they're involved in the murder of this guy, Ruby Stein, who was, I think he was a bookmaker, might have been a loan shark too. Okay. His book, though, was what everyone wanted. His book was worth over millions, like whatever, all the names that he had who owed him money. Dude. And so at one point, the leaders of the Westies, this guy Jimmy Coonan and the guy named Mickey Featherstone, they have a connection with the Gambinos, a guy named Roy DeMeo. Roy DeMeo was a stone-cold psychopath and ran a crew that alleged to have killed 250 people. And and the Murder Machine, great book about that crew. And Roy says, that they're being called. they have to meet with Paul Castellano in the city. And so Coonan and Featherstone go. They tell their crew, if we're not out in a certain time, you're to go in blasting. Like, we're going to call you. We're going to tell you how everything's going, but at the same time, we want you close just in case. We don't come out, you take them out. So they go have a meeting with Castellano. They deny knowing anything about Stein's death, disappearance, because I think they only found part of Ruby Stein. And I think he washed up on one of the Rockaway beaches. And basically, Castellano says they're going to form an alliance. But he's like, no more unsanctioned killings.
Okay.
So they're like, all right. They go back to the apartment where these guys are, find out they all got stoned and passed out. So they would have been screwed if they decided to pull the plug on them. I mean, they were meeting in a mob-connected restaurant. You know, like, there's a possibility they could have just never walked out, or just taken a long ride. They'd eventually implode between paranoia, drugs, and, power structure. I mean, Coonan started thinking he was Italian, and, Featherstone got pissed because he winds up doing time and kind of getting forgotten, wife not taken care of. And then they frame him for a murder he didn't do.
Damn.
Which was crazy.
Police did, or his gang did?
His gang did. And because they had a guy dressed, like, kind of altered his appearance with makeup to look like Featherstone. And when Featherstone agrees to testify, he's like, as long as you get me up, clear me of this murder. Yeah. And they use his wife. His wife wears a wire on the shooter. Yeah. Then eventually brings down the Westies. They're supposedly still around in a loose way, but I'm like, never what they were. They wind up.
That's
one of the guys did a shooting. The Union guy for John Gotti, John O'Connor, that was one of the Gotti trials, was a Westie.
Okay. Because I pulled them up on Wikipedia, and it says there's a little, but that's again, I can't think of. I mean, I'm sure there's some mob now, and I liked how you were talking about how there's always going to be, if there's like vices, a black market, and it reminds me of. Have you ever watched Man in the High Castle?
No, I've heard it's great. I've never watched it.
You got to watch it, but the Yakuza is in there, and so the premise is the Nazis in Japan won the war, so they split the country, but the Yakuza. I mean, they've been around for thousands, or I don't know. I mean, at least 100 centuries. And the reason why they exist is because if there's ever something that's a black market or difficult, and they still exist today, and they still wield more power than like the Italian mob wields today. But
not a surprise. I mean, but when we were talking about the whole thing with when witnesses didn't talk, well, the other thing was, they were the honored society, the men of respect, helping solve problems. But like everything else, any good ideology can be used for your own gain, perverted, whatever you want to call it. And that's what happened to the mafia. Like, it might have started out as like a, like civility, like a civic sort of organization. Yeah. But once it started being about, the dollar signs and, how I could be to the top, who do I got to, get rid of, and who do I need to make alliances with, it changes. Mm-hmm. And, you look at something like the Chicago outfit. Chicago outfit stayed as strong as they did because they were that tight knit. I mean, still a large group. I mean, but you had bosses outside of Capone and a couple other guys, Frank Nitti, who ended up offing himself as opposed to going to jail. You had guys like Tony Accardo, who I think only spent a night in jail his entire life.
Good for him.
Yeah, Tony Accardo was a tough guy. He wound up when they had to get rid of Sam Giancana, even though I still think that might have been CIA too, because Giancana was going to testify or was set to face the church committee, answering about the Castro plots.
No way. Because I was going to bring that up, that I know the mob was involved with Cuba, and weren't they involved? Who was the dictator? We put him there. It wasn't Cuba. It was around there. He flew up. Or someone wrote a paper on him, like a college teacher, and they kidnapped him. Who was the guy he wrote the paper on? Do you remember I'm talking? It was like in the 60s. There's a college professor in New York. There's an installed dictator somewhere in South or Central America.
In the Dominican Republic, maybe?
Yes,
I think they were involved with him too.
He was a nut shark. They fed the guy to the sharks, right?
Yeah.
What was his name again? The dictator?
Trujillo.
Trujillo, yes. And I thought the mob was involved with that, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think they had gambling places down there. I mean, so they might have been. I mean, friendly dictator, whether it be a guy like Batista in Cuba or Trujillo, or, I mean, eventually I think they wound up getting involved. One of the islands, I think they got involved with Resorts International. I know that Lansky did. I don't know if that was Bahamas or whatnot. And, you know, you give them an opportunity, they were going to take it. Especially, everyone thinks that they got, once Castro nationalized the casinos, that bankrupted a lot of them. I'm like, well, they still had Vegas. You know, like Lansky was still involved in Vegas. They like to put up this, you know, myth that Lansky was bust by the time he died. I don't think that's true at all. And I think he was smart enough to, like, this guy is this smart. And you think all of a sudden he quit? I'm like, I don't think so. Guys like that don't stop.
No. And that's like when they say, like, oh, the Rothschilds don't have, if you looked at today, how are the Rothschilds, and they're like, well, they've lost all. It's like, what do you mean they lost? They didn't lose their money. They were billionaires in the 1800s. What they do with it? They threw it away? What are you talking about?
they have a way to parlay it in some form. You know, there's when there's a will, there's a way, and the desire to cultivate that, I don't think dies. You know, like, I mean,
I agree.
There's always a way. There's always a way. But yeah, no, with the partnership between government, whether it be CIA or, like I said, municipal government, whatever the case is, there's always a quid pro quo. The CIA, well, geez, I mean, drug routes lead to, you know, interchange with guns, interchange with buying the goodwill of the soldiers that were trying to get to fight, you know, the communists. And whether you had the Golden Triangle, which was Asia, what was it? The Crescent Triangle, which was Afghanistan.
Yes.
And, you know, the French connection, whether it be Marseille or, you know, Corsica, whatever the case may be, there was always a way for a long time to partner up, move drugs, fight communists. I mean, the French
American things.
French connection, I think, emanated because of, we were trying to break up the dock worker strikes in Italy. That was like one of the first covert actions, I think, that the CIA did.
Really?
I believe, I'm pretty sure that was. I mean, so yeah, there was a part. I mean, and again, we already had partnerships based on World War II. I mean, I think we had helped kind of put some of those bosses back in position with the invasion. Right. And, you know, I'm sure memories were long in a good way, or to them, not us, because in the end, we're the ones who got screwed. But yeah, I never ceases to amaze me. You know, I mean, Chicago, you had two of the biggest corruption cases came about in the 70s and 80s, and it was Greylord and Gambit, which was short for gambling attorney, the guy who was the informant, helped expose, you know, judges, prosecutors, aldermen, all taking money, all involved in fixing cases and just owning that city.
Right.
And it's still crooked, because how many people need to be shot in Chicago every weekend before something gets done?
Agreed.
And that's not even organized crime. That's just corruption.
And I want to go back to how you brought up because this is in Paul Williams' Operation Gladio book. Based on, like, I know there's all these reasons why we were in Vietnam and all these reasons why we got back in Afghanistan, but it's very weird how you just said all this heroin's being grown in Vietnam. The communists come in, they say supposedly they're going to, I think they try to stop the opium production war there. And then there was an amazing statistic, and I think I have it, but in Afghanistan in 1999, I'm going to make it up, like 4,000 tons of opium was produced in 1999. And then 2000, the Taliban or Al Qaeda takes over, whatever name they went by, I forget. They take over. They cut poppy production like in half. It drops from like 4,000 to 2,000. Then 9/11 happens. We go in there. Poppy production goes back. It surpasses its highest level. It's at like 40,000 tons. And while we're there, so it made me wonder, like, how closely related are all these wars and drug dealing?
A lot. I think it's a lot. Going back what's that? I got to read the book, but I know enough about it. Dope Inc., the one that came out years ago.
Yes, dude, I just bought that.
That's, I mean, going back to like the East India Company, you know, like drugs have figured into the opium wars. There's so many things, that drugs have been, you know, popular. They might try to disguise it, but I think ultimately, drugs have figured into a lot. And
that's what that book's, because it's how it built the British Empire and helped the French Empire. I mean, and people like, I don't think they think about that anymore, but that the reason why it was so big was the British was they wanted all the silk and all this fancy stuff, all their silver was going to China. So then they get a deal. They were able to put the bank HBSCU or whatever in Hong Kong. And the reason why they did this and then started giving opium there is because they wanted the silver back. They were losing all of their money to China. And they're like, well, how do we get this back? Well, let's get them all addicted on drugs. And that's what they did.
Yeah. Never surprised me with that. There's something I was going to say about the drugs. I mean, I think I remember reading a book about World War II. It was actually one of my college classes when they were talking about the problem with Chiang Kai-shek and his soldiers.
Yes.
And he had, what would they call it? The KMT, the Kuomintang.
Yes.
And one of the Americans higher ups, I think it was Stilwell, one of the generals said, we're going to have a problem. He's like, they deal in drugs. They're corrupt. Like this was in the 40s.
Right.
And it's funny because I didn't hear KMT again until I read The Crimes of Patriots by Jonathan Whitney, which was about the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia.
Yes.
But, I mean, that's organized crime too. CIA, organized crime,
They're the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Working together and just kind of, you know, and that one of those eye-opening books, to be honest.
Yeah.
And, you know, as long as there's money to be made. But yeah, you're seeing with Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance. You know, the Northern Alliance are the ones who are the big drug dealers. We make our partnership with them. The one person who I think may not have been as involved with drugs, what happens? He gets taken out 2 days before 9/11. Shah Massoud, you know, gets taken out by two guys impersonating a camera team. And, you know, like he might have been the one, because the other one that we were using at one point as an ally, which is a very loose term, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, hated our guts and was a huge drug dealer. But apparently we thought, hey, he hates these guys more, so it won't turn against us, even though we at one point were undertaking a mission to buy back all of our stingers that we'd given to the Afghanis. Which who'd have thought? Like that's almost like the gun buyback program. Like really,
right.
you think they're gonna give them back?
You're right.
Yeah.
Well,
no.
And you brought up the KMT, and that was where we got the Paul Helliwell, who helped Disney buy all his land in Florida, just because he loved them. They were good friends. That's where Paul got the idea to sell drugs to fund the war against, because that's what the KMT was doing. They were selling heroin to the public. They were an army drug dealing gang. That was it.
Castle Bank goes, and then you get Nugan Hand goes, and then like there's always another. And as long as you have the banks that are going to launder that drug money,
and they still do.
Yeah.
Didn't Wells Fargo just got hit like 3 years ago? They got fined like $1 billion because they were laundering cartel drug money.
Yep.
And anyone could go look. Like they literally got a measly fine for laundering drug money.
It always is, because like I was just talking. It was funny enough with my mother, actually. Man, it might be drug money in the long run with Wall Street. But I was talking about Michael Milken, the junk bond king, when he got busted for insider trading, and Giuliani prosecuted him. He gets a handful of years in jail, and I think his fine was $500 million. Okay. But he's a philanthropist now. I said I've seen him interviewed at Met games, and I'm a huge Met fan. And like Mike Milken, I said, that guy. So the one that's like semi-based on the Michael Douglas's character in Wall Street is semi-based on him. I'm like, it's a piece of garbage. And it's like, nope, he's a philanthropist now, So like 500 million was a drop in the bucket for him. You got to figure some of these guys. Barry Seal.
Yes, let's talk about Barry. Wait, I was going to grab my book, but let's talk about Barry Seal. Go ahead.
I mean, Barry Seal, when he gets killed, right? Set up. Basically, because put up in a halfway house where he's not allowed to be armed, and they need to know where he is. He needs to be home.
Tell everybody if they don't know who Barry Seal is.
All right, Barry Seal was one of the biggest drug traffickers in United States history. Definitely one of the top ones in the world, I'm sure, who worked with the Medellin cartel. I don't know so much about Cali, but definitely the Medellin cartel. You know, he was a Southerner, big guy. They called him El Gordo because he was a big guy, liked his food.
Yeah.
Definitely nothing like Tom Cruise, an American Made, and which was total limited hangout of a movie if there ever was one. I didn't see it. I had no desire to. Once I found out they weren't going to listen to Daniel Hopsicker's research on Barry
That's the
Seal.
book I have signed.
Barry and the Boys.
Yes.
Great book. But yeah, Barry Seal had, he'd been a pilot for, I believe it was TWA. He loses his job for smuggling. It wasn't drugs, though. And he actually, at one point, gets arrested for trying to smuggle explosives, I believe for an anti-Castro plot, and involves a guy who's connected to the Gambinos. So there's a mafia connection there as well.
Yep.
And so at one point, Seal, who already has connections. I mean, let's talk about the fact he was in the Civil Air Patrol with David Ferry.
Yes.
And Ferry's mob connected.
I'm sorry, just tell because I know we both like what's the Civil Air? Sorry. Can you tell?
Civil Air Patrol almost seems like it was like Boy Scouts, but flying, like flying Boy Scouts, like young kids, because Lee Harvey Oswald was in Civil Air Patrol and he was only like 14, 15.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And the head of the Civil Air Patrol in Louisiana was a convicted pedophile named David Ferry.
Didn't he wear, and he's an FBI, right? He's an FBI or CIA?
He was CIA connected.
CIA, and he wear like he was known to wear like a red wig. Like, didn't he have
he had alopecia? Yeah.
Okay.
And fake eyebrows. He'd use a rug, like an actual rug. Like they said, he used carpet stuff, like samples for his eyes and stuff.
All right, here, I'm going to pull up this. Here's a perfect. I assume this is him. Let me just so for people listening, they can see what David Ferry looks like.
He was a weird looking dude.
He literally looks like look at this guy, dude.
Yep.
All right, continue. Dude.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, he was an interesting guy. So yeah, Barry Seal was in his Civil Air Patrol, but Barry Seal, might have had CIA connections from when he was like in his 20s, which Daniel Hopsicker alleges in Barry and the Boys, which I do believe is a pretty authoritative account. Yeah. But Seal at some point, I think in the 70s, late 70s, starts getting involved. I think it was first with marijuana smuggling and then proceeds to get into cocaine smuggling. And originally he's based out of, I want to say originally it's out of Louisiana.
Okay.
And he's flying drugs and great pilot, known to get in and out of some hairy situations like David Ferry. And Seal starts going back and forth. And then as the Contra War, our desire to keep the Contras body and soul together and get around a amendment that cut off all covert funding leads to the drugs gun money pipeline. And Barry Seal has an aspect out of it, first out of Louisiana and then out of the Mina airstrip in Arkansas.
Why Arkansas, Phil? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, hey, when you got a governor who has designs on becoming president at some point, hey, I mean, Bill Clinton, I think, had a relationship with the CIA too that goes, precedes,
absolutely,
a lot of those events. And Seal's protected. He doesn't get busted. At one point, when he's killed, they find George Bush's personal office number in his pocket. So that would be the second person who's got George Bush's personal number or something. Him and George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's handler in Texas. So Seal is just bringing these drugs in, bringing the drugs, guns back and forth. They utilize his plane to take surveillance of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. I mean, the rebels allegedly offloading drugs. And that's utilized to say, hey, Sandinistas are dealing drugs, even though I don't believe there ever was. I think it was very, circumstantial. I don't think it had anything on the Sandinistas. But Seal is moving a lot of weight. And a lot of those drugs eventually wind up in places like South Central Los Angeles. Eventually later on you get the Ricky Ross pipeline. I mean, that was a little different, but There's nothing to say that drugs in Arkansas didn't wind up there either.
No.
But Seal eventually gets busted. He agrees to work with the DEA at first, but eventually he's like facing multiple trials. He gets convicted. He's sentenced to the halfway house despite his testimony. And his life isn't worth anything at that point.
Right.
And he's set up to be killed. He's killed February 86, brutal assassination. Afterwards, his bank account, which had in the billions.
Jeez, I didn't know that.
Yeah, in the billions. They raid his house. They still, then his plane, the Fat Lady, was utilized by the Contra effort, and that plane is shot down in El Salvador later in 1986. So Seal kind of gets the last laugh because that exposes the Contra operation.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, his plane shot out of the sky. One survivor. The guy's taken prisoner. A guy named Eugene Hassenfuss, and he was like, I think, the kicker on the plane, supposed to kick the cargo out. Gets shot down. He survives. He gives up the Contra side of the operation.
Wow.
And but Seal, like in terms of that drug ring, protected. Anytime they tried to get a grand jury, they limited it. Asa Hutchinson, who was the U.S. attorney down there, might have taken a knee on that case, just not pushed it. Instead of having all these witnesses about what was going on at Rich Mountain Aviation in Mina, the Intermountain Regional Airport, he limited it to the testimony. Eventually, it was an IRS agent named Bill Duncan, and there was a state trooper named Russell Welch. Russell Welch passed a couple of years ago. He's actually got infected with anthrax not that long after working on the case. Pre 9/11, getting infected with anthrax, and
totally by chance.
Yeah, and they were they were told we were limited in what we could answer. Like the questions were limited to us, and this is BS. That sort of thing. But Seal, like I've read stuff that talks about him being involved with, I think it was Richard Brennicky, who was a pilot, said that Seal's drugs might have wound up with the Gambinos, and like there was a connection there, and but then again, it's tough to tell. Like when some of these guys who are pilots, what's true, what's boasting, and what's disinformation, and all that stuff in there.
John, what's up, dude? Oh, your mic, dude. Your mic. It's okay, buddy. I can't hear you. I think I was gonna sign off soon, but it was so. Do you have any? Oh, there you go.
I want to be disrespectful. I'm sorry for.
You're so nice, buddy.
I had some really spicy food, and it's really been messing with me. So it took me a while to.
Hey, I get it. Say no more, my friend.
Break away from that. So I apologize.
That's pretty important stuff. You don't want to break away from that.
And my daughter got out of school today for throwing up. So I don't know, maybe a norovirus for all I know. I'm not 100% sure. I am the fix your gut guy. So I guess we'll find out. I started taking some activated charcoal. Right. But I apologize for not. I didn't want to be rude and not.
Oh, dude. Up. Well, you're so. We'll do it again. This is Phil. John. Phil's heard you on Charlie.
Yes, I see him on Twitter too. By the way. So
Phil,
how you doing, John? Nice to meet you.
You as well too, Phil. I've been listening when I was not feeling so well.
Well, good. Well, good.
So,
nice.
But you're right about Barry Seal. Man, I got a little bit of brain fog right now. I was trying to think of. You ever read Hopsticker's book, Barry and the Boys?
Yeah, we were just talking about that.
Yeah, the stuff that he mentions about Barry Seal, because I know you guys were talking about David Ferry early too. It's just very interesting stuff that a lot of people really don't know about. Did you guys see the recent, was it Scorsese movie where they did the digital editing on
The Irishman?
Yeah.
The Irishman, yes, that was Scorsese, right?
Yes.
Kind of an interesting movie of what they were able to tell in that movie, huh? I mean, you had David Ferry in there, right?
They called him a fairy named Ferry, which I was like,
Ferry, yeah. And so it was a good movie, but it was very interesting what was in that movie, though. What they were able to get away with, and I know some people would say it's supposed to be in there that it's some sort of predictive programming or not predictive programming per se, but programming in there for people and stuff like that and everything. But it's still, I actually think I think Martin Scorsese is actually a very talented director.
Oh God, yes.
And I like a majority of his movies. You know, which is saying a lot because there's many directors in Hollywood that I don't necessarily. I despise Quentin Tarantino, for example. I hate Pulp Fiction. I think it's a garbage movie. I know it's gonna make a lot of people mad, but you're not here for my hating movie takes. I'm just not a big movie guy. I have really crap taste in television shows. All right, but you guys didn't come for that. So, well,
we'll have to. So I gotta go take care of my animals, but you're so nice. You jumped on, John. You didn't have to do that, but that was so nice of you. So if you have any final words, John, for the people?
Something crazy did happen in the news today. One last thing, man, something really did happen. I'm trying to jog my brain. A couple of things happened. One, Kanye was interviewed by Tucker.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Okay, I'm definitely gonna have to listen to that as a Kanye fan. All right, which is a spicy take. A lot of people are gonna be upset about that. But I do think Kanye's very talented. I think he's just extremely arrogant. He's got problems.
He is very talented.
I guess they fast track a new radiation medicine. Mark from Houstonic Live was talking about that in an earlier stream, that they fast tracked a new drug to help prevent against radiation burns, I think.
Yeah, they're getting ready for something.
Yeah. Well, then again, I've gone through this whole thing where I don't think nuclear missiles in the way that they kind of say they'll end the world. I just don't think I just don't.
We're gonna have to. I will have to do a show with Phil, Phil, on your opinion on, because I'm on John's camp. But then we're gonna get on. Then I'm gonna be stuck here for another hour.
Yeah, that is true. and Jack is trying to go take care of his 8 million cats he has.
I know. I know.
But I'm sorry, you guys. I also like Aaron said previously in the chat. That's a nice bathroom you're in now, Jack. Even though you're under the stairs like Harry Potter. I guess, you know, which don't go, kids don't watch Harry Potter. It'll tempt you into Satanism. All right. But good night, everybody. Even though, what's her name? J.K. Rowling, if she ever did truly write Harry Potter or not, that's another discussion. Okay. But she is a turf.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is. Yes.
Well, that's all I got.
That's perfect, John. And everyone, John's We've Read at We've Read, and I'll put his link. He'll still make the show notes. Phil, any last words? Where can people find you and all those things?
At Vic Foster on Twitter and pretty much, most social media at this point. And, that's pretty much it. Still doing book reviews and a lot of interesting stuff there. So.
Perfect. Well, Phil, thanks for doing it. Everybody, we had 20 people here. Thank you. Great comments. Sunday, I think I'll be with Nick Hinton. That's my big guest. So only people that listen to the show will know this. And so I'll see you guys on Sunday.
Super chats.
And so I think I'm going to open up super chats too, guys. You got a big question. You can send $1 and maybe I'll share it with Nick, or so we'll figure it out. But so I'll see you guys Sunday. All right, guys, take care. Much love. God bless.
Peace. God bless everybody.